It's now time for section 4, and section 4 is a little bit different because we're going to be focused more on design and function and a little bit less on method, because I think by now you already probably have a pretty good understanding of subtractive synthesis, which refers specifically to a signal flow where you have an oscillator coming before a filter. So your sound generators build up a thick waveform, doesn't necessarily have to be thick, and then a filter can further massage that, and that's why it's considered subtractive. Note that it's not really referring to the sound in any way, because you could actually start with a dull sound and have the filter open up if it's a low-pass filter, thus making it more bright, and in many ways you're actually adding more partials, more harmonics, and the sound is becoming richer and denser. But at the same time, it's still considered subtractive synthesis because of the signal flow. Instead, our focus is going to be on analog, virtual analog, and wavetable software synthesizers, how we can categorize these things, and for the first time, really thinking about this more as an artist and a producer as compared to being more or less a student or an academic, mainly because subtractive synths, and what I'm referring to as subtractive synths, where a filter plays a major role in the sound, make up about 90% of the market share, with most of the sounds that you're hearing in popular records and experimental records and any music that's using synthesizers, probably over 90% of the sounds developed are coming from these type of instruments where a filter plays such a critical role. All right, so how did subtractive synthesizers come into being? Really, they're the logical evolution, the logical offshoot of the modular synthesizer. A subtractive synth design, when you think about it, it's probably like the most popular hardwired version of a signal flow that you would be configuring yourself with the modular synth. So let's imagine that you have a Moog modular. You take your oscillator, you run that into the filter. You take the output of the filter, you run that into a VCA, and that's the way most of the sounds that you create, that would be the signal flow that you would run. And so it makes sense to say, okay, well, why don't we just simplify all of this and put it into a container that's accessible and that's affordable for a lot more people? And that's basically how the subtractive synthesizer is born. You take the same modules, you stick them in a smaller container, and then in the back on the circuit board, you hardwire that signal flow so that you as the user can't really adjust that. You still have your oscillators, your filters, your LFOs, and your envelopes. Nothing has really changed. And, this is why I think that learning modular synthesis and modular synthesizers makes a lot of sense before you even get into subtractive, so that you can make those connections of patching up the modules and understanding the reasons why you would do that. With subtractive synths, it's usually pretty difficult not to make a usable sound, regardless of the experience that you have. And that's because there are limitations, there are limits. And in a lot of ways, that's actually a really good thing. If you're in the flow as a creator and you want to sound quickly, you know that you can pull to your stock subtractive synthesizer, flip through some presets, and maybe be able to make a couple modifications right then and there. Or even if you have a hardware analog synthesizer that's subtractive in nature, you can make those adjustments quick, continue on with what you're doing. A modular synthesizer, it's not that easy. You need to patch it up, and chances are you're 15, 20, 30 minutes later, and you still don't maybe have a sound that fits for what you envisioned. That's, I think, where subtractive synths have really stepped up the game, and is the reason why most of the software synthesizers developed still follow that same basic logic and principle. It's to make you and give you something usable very quickly so as not to distract you from making your music. Why subtractive? Why this evolution and development? And I think most of these reasons are pretty self-explanatory. We think back to the modular synth, and its reason for development really was to replace the studio musicians. So if you had one modular synth, you'd be able to emulate a brass ensemble, strings, bass, etc., piano, whatever. And we obviously know that's not true, and that instead you just had very different timbres. But with a subtractive synthesizer, what you end up having is at the same time the subtractive synth is becoming popular, tape machines and recording to tape is also becoming cheap and something that people can do in their own bedrooms. The original bedroom music producers were people who picked up kind of cheap 4-track tape machines and went to town with them. And so you're noticing that the only people who can afford modular synths are people with backing from major record companies, and they take up tons of space. They would take up your entire bedroom to have a modular synthesizer. So clearly the market is going to respond to this advent of bedroom recording, and thus you have these smaller, more compact, easy to use subtractive synths. And a lot of the artists who are working with these have been inspired by sounds that they've heard on modular synthesizers. And so the subtractive synth is actually now emulating some of these modular sounds, just giving it to you in a package that's much easier to manage. Price and cost, huge factor in this. Clearly a fraction of the cost to get a subtractive synthesizer, something hardwired, mass-produced, as compared to all that goes into those modular synths. Ease of use relative to modular. Like I said before, you don't need to be a scientist to figure this out. You can be a musician, and it's clearly not alchemy. Portability, modular synthesizers, you can't really take them on stage. It takes way too long to change sounds like in between songs because you have to do all of that wiring yourself. With a subtractive synth, it might only take a minute, sometimes less than that if you have like a Polaroid picture. And then eventually we get to the point of recall once you get those CPU chips, something that would never be possible with a hardware modular synth. You can now flip through presets very, very quickly, and you're off to the races making music. And for these same reasons, this is oftentimes why subtractive synthesizers continue to be so popular, even when we could save and recall presets as we saw in the modular software domain. It's just we've gone so far away from that. It's such the minority now that the subtractive hardwired synths seem to be what people expect, and that's what continues to get developed and sold on a regular basis. All right, so subtractive, this is a question that I've often asked myself, is we know that basically all forms of synthesis in one way or another add or subtract partials. So even with an additive synthesizer, right, you choose those sign banks and you can kind of maybe modulate between them. You can add more, take some away at a certain time. Why is that not considered subtractive? And the reason really is subtractive synthesis, you want to associate that with filter bias, or there's a big significance placed on the filter, would probably be another way of saying this. Filter centric. I was trying to think of the right word and kind of struggling. We associate subtractive synthesis with filters. And you can kind of see the evolution and progression of this with the Minimoog to what we see in Diva to then at the end here with Serum, where you're getting this great display that you can actually use, and that makes learning a lot easier. That's what's so cool about this is you pick up a synthesizer like Serum, and there's so much visual feedback for you. It really speeds up that learning curve and that learning process. But to me, I consider anything subtractive when the filter plays a major role in the sound design, even if it means you're using an instrument that may be considered FM, like FM8. If the filter is ultimately shaping the sound, it's subtractive, at least to me, in my opinion. All right, moving on. Why is there confusion? If it's so simple, if it's just oscillator, filter, amplifier, why do people seem to think that they need to take a course on Diva and then take another course on Silent and another course on Spire? I think it really just comes down to supply and demand. There's a demand for subtractive synths, and it continues to be filled by all sorts of different companies who have their own take on designing these instruments. And so, yeah, when you look at an instrument like Silent for the first time and compare it to something like Diversion, you're at a loss. Like, how are these two things at all related? And that's where I think the confusion comes into play. And there are probably at least 100 synthesizers, software and hardware, that follow the basic subtractive signal flow, and yet people still seem to get very confused. Part of it is they all do look and they sound different. Even if it's oscillator, filter, amplifier, What type of oscillator? How thick is it? How many voices can you stack? What sort of filter are you using? And then really, I think a lot of times, what about the built-in effects? What about the graphic user interface? That tricks people, and they forget that the method itself remains very, very consistent, just a matter of figuring out how to navigate to it and to see then, okay, well, now I'm hearing the timbre difference, but I know that the method is the same. So our focus is navigating, or I should say learning to navigate, and also how to listen to spot these differences, and then to ultimately find the right fit for the song that you're working on. Let's just trace the progression with some pictures. It begins here with this Moog modular. You can see the design. You see all those inputs and those outputs that you're going to have to cable up yourself. But then the big breakthrough was the pared down version of this, which is the mini Moog. And I have a couple of different images of that. So we still have our modules, and they're labeled as such with controllers, oscillator, bank, mixer, modifiers, filter, output. Only now you don't have to worry about patching these up. This is pretty much the signal flow, and it's going to remain consistent like this no matter what you try to do, unless you break open the guts and attempt to like re-cable something or resolder something, which not many people were interested in doing. But for the most part, this isn't any different from the Moog modular, only that these modules are put in here, they're hardwired, and you can't replace them, and you also can't get that many sounds, right? Like you can't run one oscillator into another oscillator to create an FM. It's just not really possible here. Although I guess it is technically possible, but let's, for the sake of example, pretend that it isn't. And I'm sure we'll look at that and talk about it moving forward. But for the most part, very simple, pared down version. This is what people were wanting. This is the sounds people were making with modular, and they said, give it to me in something that's much more compact and easy to work with. All right, on to software now. I'm just showing you how one instrument has been modeled so many times. So this is G-Force's version of the Mini Moog. You can see the similarities here almost immediately. We can see Arturia's Mini Moog, another software version. And just keep in mind that all of these are going to sound different based on how, they're coded. This is obviously the real thing. You then have this put into software, another software version, another software version, and then we have something that's a little more generic in Diva. This isn't necessarily supposed to sound like the Mini Moog, but you can clearly see the similarities here. And many, many, many more. Oftentimes, the stock synthesizer that comes with your DAW owes and pays homage to the Mini Moog, in that you have two oscillators and one filter. And we can see that here with the polysynth inside of Bitwig Studio. It's also true with the retro synth inside of Logic, and I'm sure with the analog inside of Ableton. The list goes on and on and on. Okay, so what we really need to do in this introductory video is kind of lay out what we'll be looking at moving forward. And to do that, what we're really focused on is kind of defining these different software classes. You could also refer to these as categories. And I break it down in three ways. One type of subtractive synth that you're going to find in software is analog. And these are emulations of specific instruments, of actual analog hardware instruments. And to know whether or not it's considered analog, you just have to ask, okay, was this instrument made with real parts? Did they have a physical oscillator, physical filters, and so forth? So I'm not saying that software synthesizers are actually analog, but anything that I see that harkens back to an original unit, both in terms of design and sound, I put into the analog category, and there's quite a number of emulation-based subtractive synths out there. We then have virtual analog, probably the most popular category, which is more or less a generic emulation. If we go back and we look at both the polysynth and Diva, we can see that especially in Diva, it has a design that's supposed to look like old school and analog, but I wouldn't look at this and immediately think Mini Moog or think Prophet 5. That's just not the way I interpret this. I think, okay, this is Diva's attempt. This is Yuhi's attempt at something that's supposed to sound analog, but is a little bit more generic. With the polysynth, I'm expecting something a little more modern with the sound, not as dirty just based on looking at it, but I still know that it's virtual analog. And then we have Wavetable, and normally Wavetable, it's more or less a subset of VA and even analog to some degree, just a new functionality, another way of pushing the sound before you go into the filter. And oftentimes in the digital era with Massive and Sarah, what we're talking about is morphing or modulating between wave shapes and using that to, again, adjust that spectrum before going into a filter. And in some cases, wave shape can exist as its own method if you elect not to use a filter at all and instead have those different balances of harmonics be shifting to almost emulate more of a filter, but kind of like a specialty filter. So we'll get to that in the actual example videos. All right, let's start with analog. At the top, you can see a Roland Juno synth, and at the bottom, we see the guts of that synthesizer. Definitely check out matrixsynth.com if you want to see a lot of really cool pictures of old synthesizers, and then you can check online and see if they've made software plugin versions of them. But you can see all these different circuit boards are being put into effect here, and so that's really kind of what makes this analog. These will break down, very difficult to repair. This one looks like they have some vacuum tubes in here. Must be for the output stage, but just one example here of an analog synth. In the computer, tons of examples. We have a tall Uno, which is, I believe, an emulation of this Juno synth. We have the Repro 1, which is an emulation of the Sequential Circuits Pro 1. It's called something like that. I can't remember the name of it right now. We have the ME80, which is an emulation of the CE80. And then at the bottom right, we have the OBXD, which is an emulation of Oberheim synthesizers. And so all of these look very different, but for the most part, the controls are the same. So if you can just find your oscillators, if you can find your filter, if you can find your VCA and your envelopes and your LFOs, you're in pretty much good shape. So just because these all look very different doesn't mean that the method is any different, but the sound certainly should be. When I listen to the OBXD compared to the TAL Uno, they sound totally different, just like the hardware sounds totally different, right? Because if you think about it, everybody's designing their own oscillator, their own filter, going through completely different circuitry, and therefore it's going to sound quite a bit different. And that's why people collect not only the hardware versions, but often the software versions, because they all have their own unique character to them, despite using the same method. All right, on to virtual analog. These instruments, if you were to open them up, it more or less looks like the inside of a computer. You have a, motherboard, you have a computer chip, and that's what's creating these sounds. They take cues from the analog synthesizers of yore, but it's all modeled with a computer. So we have the Virus at the top and we have the Nord lead at the bottom, two very popular options. I actually do have an Access Virus sitting here next to me, which I don't use as much anymore, but it has its own unique character to it. All right, it doesn't really fit in with any synth from the past or anything in the future, based on the modeling of how these people have written the code that ultimately generates the sound. But these do, though, in some ways, pay a little bit more homage to analog in that you actually do have to run outputs. So there is some kind of actual, physical component to this that allows you to get sound and pass it through. And I think that's a reason why a lot of people do still swear by these things. The irony is that these virtual analog synths and their sound, and again, these more or less are trying to emulate, these just in their own way. Even these guys themselves have been emulated in software with things like the Synth 1 and the Nord Reactor Ensemble. So even virtual analog hardware has been adopted into software, as you can see. But the more popular options, these are the ones that most of you are probably already familiar with. These are what generate a lot of debate in terms of what is the best virtual analog synth, but I would argue that you can't really say best or worst. They all just have their own character. So while these instruments all look completely different, their signal flow is still for the most part the same, but they all have their own special effects. Clearly, they all have their own interfaces and they all have little quirks that make them unique. And then the sound engine themselves, the main sort of underlying code, what gives it its color, very different from instrument to instrument here. And this is where it takes a discerning ear to know what synth is going to fit the song that you're working on. And last but not least, we come to Wavetable. This is kind of a cheesy image of the Waldorf PPG Wave 2. But I just included this image because it was the only thing that was Creative Commons. I just wanted you to know that Wavetable does have some callback to the analog days. The difference being that a digital sampler still exists, and that's what's holding the wavetables. So instead of just having to use your basic oscillators, your physical oscillators that are generating sawtooth, square, sine, instead you do have samples that are doing that. And so instead of just having to stick to those basic wave shapes, you can use a variety of things. So this instrument is really a hybrid in that you have tons of different wave shape options, but the filters and everything else remains completely analog, thus the size of it. As we can see here, again, there's a software version of this. I think more for posterity's sake than actual use. But if you're a fan of this instrument and some of the people who used it in the past, some of the artists from the 80s, you might want to pick it up because it sounds very similar to the original. But what we are used to talking about with Wavetable are these modern instruments, Massive being the one that was kind of a huge game changer, and then also Serum. So since wavetables are just digital samples, you'll find that most modern soft synths, including the ones that claim to be very retro VA offerings, they will have wavetable functionality as well. It then's just a question of whether or not you use them. So if we go back to this page, I'm pretty sure that Spire, Diversion, and Dune all give you a morphing wavetable option if you want to use it, because it's so easy to implement that in. And so clearly other code has to be written to give it more or less that VA sort of character. But these two instruments usually associated with being a little bit more digital sounding. And you can clearly see, especially over in Serum, that we have something modulating the wavetable position, and that gives you a whole nother level of sonic manipulation and change to that harmonic series, to that spectrum. So for me, and this isn't technically the way that we would define wavetable, but I think it's useful for our purposes in this course, unless you're actually modulating the wave shape, I don't really consider it to be wavetable, because you could set up Serum or you could set up Massive to just sit statically on a wave shape that you like, and then, fuse things, go through your filter and whatever, in which case it's just basically a subtractive signal flow. Wavetable brings you a whole nother element and way to shape the sound, and there are certain times when you don't even have to use a filter. You can just be morphing through wavetables, and that can actually give you that variation. Now we start to get into this really interesting gray area of, well, what's wavetable, what's additive, what's subtractive. Just remember that in the case of a subtractive synth, anytime you're using a filter as a major component to the sound, I would argue that that really is subtractive synthesis. All right, so these are our main ideas for the upcoming course content. These synthesizers, they look different, they sound different, but fundamentally they operate under the same guiding principle. That is sound generation source, filter, amplifier. And really it's now just a question of what fits and why does it fit. There is no best. People will ask me a lot, what synth should I buy? What's going to be best? And I always say, well, what music do you make? If you're into like synthwave, for example, you're going to want to get good emulations of synths from the 80s. That's a major component to that. If you make very clean, pristine pop music, you're probably going to want to get something like Serum, whose sound engine is really, really clean. It's a matter of being able to listen and discern and figure out what makes Serum sound different to Massive, or what makes Spire sound different to Silent. Those are things that you kind of have to pick out yourself and figure out then what's going to fit the song I'm making. And then obviously you'll have your reasons for why. As long as you have your reasons why, nobody can argue with you, and I certainly wouldn't argue with you. User interface, built-in effects, and the sound engine, right? Some of those like vibe things, these all play huge roles in the final character and vibe of a synthesizer. So we're not spending a lot of time talking about the built-in effects, but sometimes that's what might take an instrument over the edge. Does it have a really unique sounding chorus? Does it have some kind of really cool distortion unit? Does that allow you to get more diverse timbres than you could get otherwise? And when you're going through and examining presets from different instruments, you'll notice how most of the time they're loaded up with effects and things. So just be aware that it can confuse you, but the method itself, very simple and is consistent throughout the board. The final sentence here, what I think is probably most important, in this presentation is that your goal as an artist or a producer is to find the synth that fits. Because remember, all of these instruments can make a bass, a lead, and a pad. So it's about differentiating the pad sound on one instrument from another. And that's something that we'll be talking about a lot in the upcoming content, which I hope you stick around for. Very excited for this week, and I hope you are as well.